Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde, welcome to this event organized by the Brazil Lab and co-sponsored by the Program in Latin American Studies with the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the Department of Anthropology. My name is João Bill. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology and direct the Brazil Lab here at Pierce. It's a great honor and pleasure to have Lilia Schwarcz with us, and we want to host this event on Brazilian authoritarianism, which is her most recent book. And we have a wonderful set of discussants. And I will briefly introduce Lili and the discussants, and then we will open up to the public to address this most timely and pressing issue. So this event centers on Lili's most recent book on Brazilian authoritarianism. Lili is one of Brazil's most creative, daring, and impactful intellectuals, a professor of anthropology at the University of São Paulo. Lili has made Princeton her home, away from home, and we couldn't be more grateful for all, Lili, you have done and are doing on so many fronts on campus, and the ways you have so gracefully helped our faculty and students. And there are so many students here that you have helped throughout the years, both here and in Brazil, including our Becoming Brazil Peers Global Seminar. So welcome all of you who have engaged with Lili and her work throughout the years. And we are so happy to have you in the coming years here at Princeton, continuing developing important collaborative projects. So really thank you, Lili, for all you have done and are doing with us here. So Lili's main areas of interest and expertise are, if you're familiar with her work, are just too many to enumerate. And she's truly amazing at all she does. Her award-winning work has addressed the history of slavery in Brazil, racial theories, history of the Brazilian Empire, and art in the post-colony. 3 of her major books that so seamlessly traverse the social sciences and the humanities have been translated into English: Spectacle of Races, Scientists, Institutions, and Racial Theories in Brazil at the end of the 19th century, The Emperor's Beard, Dom Pedro II, A Tropical King, and now recently, Brazil, a Biography. She writes regularly for Brazilian main media outlets such as Folha de São Paulo, Estado de São Paulo, and Nexo. In the last year and a half, we had 3 events with Lili here at the Brazil Lab, and astonishingly, in each one of them, she presented a new book, including last year, the one that I have not mentioned yet, Lima Barreto, the wonderful Lima Barreto book, Triste Visionário, and also the art catalog, Afro-Atlantic Histories. With her love for archives, photography, and out-of-the-way artistic representations, Lili has curated multiple exhibitions, and she has broken new artistic and public ground in Brazil through her work as a curator at MASP, the Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo. Lili's honors are many, and deservedly so. She was a Guggenheim Fellow, a John Carter Brown Library Fellow. She was a visiting professor at Oxford, Leiden, Brown, Columbia, and Harvard. And Lili has won at least 5 Jabuti Prizes, Brazil's leading literary prize. And this year, she's a finalist on 4 categories. In the category Essays, she's a finalist for the amazing Histórias Afro-Atlânticas, together with Adriano Pedrosa, Tomás Toledo, Irson Heráclito, and Eli Menezes. And it's really fascinating to see the ways she's able to bring a younger generation and a very diverse group of scholars together in collective and collaborative projects. That's part of Lili's magic. The other category, graphic design, for the catalog, Histórias Afro-Atlânticas, in the category Humanities, with Dicionário da Escravidão e Liberdade, 50 textos críticos, and then the most important Brazilian book published overseas, which is Brazil, a Biography. So Lili, thank you for all you do and for being one of us and among us. Thank you. So then we have a wonderful duet as discussants, right? So we have Deborah Diniz, who who is a deputy director of an international organization. Deborah, the right name of the organization?
International Planned Parenthood.
Yes, yes, dedicated to sexual and reproductive health and rights in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's the co-founder of ANIS, Institute of Bioethics, a prominent feminist organization based in Brazil that is dedicated to human rights and the feminist cause in Latin America. Deborah is a wonderful anthropologist, critical thinking, public intellectual. Her latest book, Zika, From Brazilian Backlands to Global Threat. Many of our students who are here read the book, right? Engaged with the book. Also a Jabuti Prize winner last year, right? And she's also a wonderful visual anthropologist. And she's currently also a visiting scholar at Brown University. She writes profusely in major international and national media outlets as well. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Deborah Diniz back to Princeton. And then we have our own Arcadio Diaz-Quiñones, who is one of the finest and most prominent Caribbean public intellectuals, ever, I should say, and one of the most special persons I have ever had the privilege of getting to know. And we all who engage with Arcadio, with his work, have benefited so deeply from his vision, from his sense of ethics, but also from his deeply committed to a scholarship that's meaningful socially and politically, and not giving up on the question of beauty and aesthetics and poetry. So he has published numerous books on leading and out-of-the-way intellectuals across the Americas. One of his most recent books, El Arte de Bregar, has actually been translated into Portuguese, and Lili, who is also a publisher, has had the pleasure of bringing that book into the Portuguese language as well. Pedro was a translator. That's fantastic. Yeah, great. So it's organized love here, and we really are deeply grateful, Arcadio, for your participation in the lab, and also for all you have given throughout the years to your students, to your colleagues, and to public scholarship. So I could say more and more and more. This is certainly a love feast, because I think to engage in these difficult times with these pressing issues, we need more and more this kind of conversation and ethos, this kind of solidarity, and this kind of daring thinking that these three incredible intellectuals represent and dedicates their lives to. So let's give them all our warmest welcome. The way we'll proceed, Lili will talk. We'll present some major ideas about her book, which I just learned today is an incredible bestseller in Brazil. Has sold over 40,000 copies already. Wow. And you guys know, some of you publish books or aspire to publish books for a social science critical book. To sell 42,000 copies is not. It's a major feat in less than a year. So Lili will talk to us about Brazilian authoritarianism, then we will hear from Arcadio, and then from Deborah, then we'll open up the conversation to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I want to start thanking Princeton University and the Brazil Lab for this invitation. Thank you, João, for introducing me in such a generous way. Thank you, Pedro, for being part of my family here. Thank you, Miquel, that I teach together, and thank you, Carol, that take care of everything. I also want to thank Professor Deborah Diniz and Professor Arcadio Diaz-Quiñones for reading my book and agreeing to discuss it today. It's really an honor. The book I'm going to present today is certainly a different one. My goal was not to reach exclusively the academic Brazilian audience. I wanted to make sense for the general reader in Brazil. So, as Arcadio uses to say for another context, this book is a kind of political work. A didactic one, as Lena Lavinius put it. But I hope that even so, you will enjoy the lecture. I agree with Deborah and Arcadio that I would talk today about the introduction of the book. And with some further delay, no further delays, I'm going to start. I often say that time's been running swift these last few years, but it's speed up since 2013, even more so in Brazil, where people went to the streets to protest for rights. But what many of us didn't see at the time was that there were two very different paths being taken. Straight lines both, with no bifurcations. Time has also run quick because of the economic crisis, recession, and unemployment that accelerated in 2014 in Brazil and generated the figure of the street avenger, those who thought and still think they were losing out to others who were gaining at their expenses. The crisis also became worse with the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff in December 2016, when Brazil politicians put on a TV variety show casting their votes in the name of sons, brothers, parents, spouses, and friends, and even God, but never actually referring to the issue at hand, the impeachment process. It was families all the way, an old specter of Brazilian history. Timothy Snyder, author of the book on tyranny, wrote a post that went viral on Facebook in which he said that we are no better or wiser than the men and women who watched the rise of Nazis, fascists, and Stalinist communists. We can only count, he said, on the benefit of experience. The problem is that we don't count on it, and we are still living a sort of global Weimar, a wave of authoritarian governments that I called in the book democraduras, democratorships, governments that seem to believe democracy ends when the urns close. It doesn't. Rights and democracy itself need to be won anew each day. My hypothesis in terms of Brazil, however, is that the question is neither circumstantial, not only global. Brazilians didn't become authoritarian and intolerant overnight. We've always been authoritarian, but we like to paint ourselves as the opposite, as peaceful, harmonious, open-minded. So I'd like to talk about the present of the past. Brazil carries the legacy of slavery, of latifundia, of patrimonialism, corruption, and it generated a society that is very unequal. Brazil has an authoritarian structure, but as always, the country was quick to present historical narratives that showed the opposite. Our slavery was very positive, as if a system that recognized one man's ownership of another could ever be so. Our dictatorship lied, practically a military democracy. There is a kind of nostalgia for old times that had never existed. Brazil was not a democracy in the past, and I'm going to organize this lecture around these lasting structures which, rather than change, just repeat in our history. I also want to talk about historical narratives, as we are passing through a kind of battle of discourses. Brazil was a big exception on the Latin American concert. It was colonized by the Portuguese, which is why we speak Portuguese instead of Spanish. That would seem obvious, but it's not, because Brazilians feel more affinity with France in the past and now to the United States than with its Latin American neighbors. Brazil became also a monarchy surrounded by republics everywhere and had an emperor as long-lasting as he was popular. A monarch who considered himself enlightened, and was in some respects, but was also the last leader to put an end to slavery, and it cost him his crown. That's why, in order to naturalize all this difference, soon after independence in 1822, we set about creating a new local history. In 1855, the new Historical and Geographical Institute organized a concours with a question: how to create a history of Brazil, that could be rephrased as how to invent a history to Brazil and for Brazil. First place went to a foreigner, the well-known Bavarian naturalist Carl von Martius, an important scientist who was, however, something of a greenhorn when it came to history in general, and Brazilian history in particular. Defining the thesis that the country stood out for its impressive mix of people and races, he wrote, I quote, "It ought to be of capital importance to the thoughtful historian to show how, over the course of Brazil's development, the conditions were laid for the perfecting of the three human races found side by side in this land." Using the metaphor of a swollen river corresponding to the Portuguese legacy that had cleaned and absorbed the little confluence of Indian and Ethiopian races, he represented the country through the singularity of its miscegenation. At this stage, however, and after so many centuries under such a violent system as slavery, simply exalting harmony was never going to cut it. What's more, Brazil's indigenous tribes were still being decimated along the coast and inland, their homelands invaded, and their culture disrespected. None of that stopped the empire from opting for a project that sealed its peace with the past and the present, and presented a nation whose happiness was measured by its capacity to blend so many diverse nations and cultures, nesting them together. Martius, who in 1832 had published an essay entitled The State of Law Among Brazil's Natives, condemning the country's indigenous tribes to disappearance, now decided to define it with a redemptive fluvial metaphor. So, there they were, the three formative peoples of Brazil together, but also different and separate. Mixture was not and never had been synonymous with equality. In fact, it served only to confirm an unquestionable hierarchy and, as the article revealed, was the consequence of a distant past lost in time. It did, however, provide an excellent way of inventing a history that wasn't only unique, a tropical and mestizo monarchy, but also rather optimist, a nation where inclusion combined rather well with exclusion. One could say that this was the beginning of the old mythology about the three formative races of the nation, which would continue to find traction through Brazil for a long time to come. Various authors would offer up variations on the same argument. Silvio Romero, Oliveira Viana, even the modernist Mário de Andrade, in his Macunaíma, offered a famous allegorical passage in which the black hero and his two brothers decide to bathe in the magical waters that fill the footprint left in earth by the Bigfoot Sumé, o Pezão de Sumé. And when they came back out, they were different. One white, one black, and one the color of the new bronze. But it was Gilberto Freire, above all, who consolidated and propagated this type of interpretation, not only in his classic Master and Slaves, but also years later in books he wrote about lusotropicalism. Arthur Ramos, who coined the term racial democracy, if it was Arthur Ramos who coined the term racial democracy, Freire was its greatest exponent, even beyond Brazil borders. Freire's thesis obtained such an international reception that it ended up knocking on UNESCO's door in the late 40s, early 50s. Excited about the work of the anthropologists from Recife and convinced that Brazil was a racial harmony for the rest of the world in war, the organization founded a major research project to prove that Brazil was a land with no racial or ethnic discrimination. The result was, to say the least, paradoxical. While the investigations the North American scholars Donald Pearson and Charles Wegley conducted in the northeast of the country confirmed Freire's presuppositions, the group in São Paulo, led by Florestan Fernandes, was arriving at the opposite conclusion. For Fernandes, the biggest legacy of slavery wasn't a nation unifying miscegenation, but the consolidation of a deep-set social inequality that could be seen from the statistics in health, education, birth and death, and housing. As Florestan Fernandes concluded, Brazilians have a sort of reactive prejudice against prejudice, as they would prefer to deny but accuse others. It was also Fernandes who called the old story of the three races the myth of racial democracy, recognizing at once the power of the narrative and the weakness of its formulation. The death sentence was delivered by the black activists, which from the end of the 70s revealed the perversion of this official discourse. The terms that best describe Brazilian contemporary situation are structural racism, institutional racism, and even recreative racism, when someone comes out with a racist joke followed by the old excuse of, I didn't mean it. Nevertheless, the story von Martius told back in the mid-19th century had the form and the style of a myth, a national myth. It took the country's fundamental problems and contradictions, such as a nationwide slavery system, and rearranged them into something positive. The text contained no dates, no precise locations, and or established contexts. It had to make sense beyond the moment it was written, to assume that the past had been glorious and the future would be even brighter still. In fact, a certain rhetoric amplified the reception, turning history into myth and myth, the social myth, into history. To naturalize inequality and hierarchy and avoid the past are characteristics of authoritarian governments. Brazilians have also traditionally described themselves as pacific despite the country's epidemic levels of violence. We are decimating a whole generation of young black men from the nation's slums, but the state do not see or talk about it. As Schwarcz says, it's the unspeakable. History and memory are ways of understanding the past that don't always match or even complete each other. History doesn't only come full of gaps, but often offers itself up as a field for debate, disagreement, and dispute. Memory, on the other hand, always presents a subjective take on events, translating the past in the first person and devoting to the past a specific recollection. As such, it recovers the present of the past and makes the past become present. Every nation creates some founding myths for itself, and these, taken as a set, have the power to rouse a sense of belonging to a single community. These are stories of such obvious impact and importance in their context that they acquire another dimension when become part of a common sense logic and theory. This is a kind of narrative that is not necessarily based on facts, as it chooses its final message first and arranges a good justifying argument for it later. Of course, von Martius wasn't alone. In the late 1800s, that was a model of history making back when the main concern was to give the past a sheen and a spin. In fact, that was the historian functions, string together some good examples from the past and so dignify the present. One way or another, the historical narratives always creates battles for the monopoly over the truth. However, it becomes particularly fertile in times of government change, as was the case in the time of von Martius' peace, but also during times of financial crisis. Under such circumstances, it's not unusual to reach back into the past for explanations for problems that lie very close to hand. It's also in times like this that people become more vulnerable and likely to believe that their rights have been disregarded, their jobs robbed, and their history taken away from them. These moments of crisis usually lead to dispute over the best version of the past, which is really a game of market cards. The construction of an official history is not, therefore, a harmless or unimportant resource. It plays a strategic role in state politics, making certain events bigger and glossing over problems that the nation experienced in the past but would rather forget, even if their causes still echo in the present. The aim is to make peace with the past, create a mythic past, lost in time, complete with harmony, but also built upon the foundations and naturalizations of structures of obedience. This type of model, largely based on imagination and projection, often functions as plaster for various common sense theories. In Brazil, common sense history tends to rest on four basic and false presuppositions. The first of these leads one to believe that Brazil is an harmonious country with no conflict whatsoever. The second, that Brazilians are averse to hierarchy and respond to adversity with informality and equality. Third, that we are a fully fledged democracy with no racial, religious, or gender-based hatreds. Fourth, that our nature is so special that we live in a real paradise, the tropics. And even God himself is Brazilian. Far from constructing real narratives, these are models that speak to deep, ambiguous agendas and which, for this very reason, driven silence and the lack of contestation. And where silence reigns, it's because there is too much noise. How can we call Brazil a peaceful country when we have centuries of slaves working our land? Let us recall that Brazil was the last country to abolish slave system in the Americas after the United States, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. If we consider only those who survived the crossing and made it to shore, according to the site Slave Voyages, 4.8 million out of the total 10.7 million made port in Brazil. In this so-called idyllic land, These enslaved experienced every imaginable form of violence and repaid with the same coin. While the master used force and mistreatment, the captives reacted with all manners of rebellion. Another question: how can Brazilians represent the nation through an idea of social harmony when we are still champions in social, racial, and gender inequality, as revealed by studies that show the existence of everyday practice of discrimination against women, indigenous groups, blacks, and the LGBTQ community? And why, with each political crisis, Brazilians lapse into the dream of an idealized old military regime as if the dictatorship had been a charmed and peaceful period. Why do we always assert this lack of hierarchy in our social relations when our past and our present so clearly contradict the myth? There is no denying that we were an extractive colony and that our land was carved up into large monocultural properties on which the master and the landowner held the monopoly of the violence, of the economic power and financial power. And though Brazil is held an increasingly urban country today, the mentality and logic of this latifundium persists stubbornly, with its masters becoming the colonels of the First Republic, and many of them transformed into political and electoral strongmen encastled to this day in their home states. The well-known family congressman, bancada dos parentes. In the face of this polarized, localized power, we end up creating patrimonial practices that imply the use of the state for personal ends. On the other hand, while Brazilians have forged more consolidated institutions over the last 30 years, political contexts are still capable of shaking them. Asking questions can be considered a form of resistance. For me, a critical history is one capable of denaturalizing what was defined as biological and therefore immutable. There is nothing in the Brazilian blood or DNA that would indicate that all these elements are immune to our human and civic action. Nor it's a good idea to do the opposite, relegate to the past and to the other who went before us everything that bothers us in the present. The racist is always someone else, never myself. Patrimonialism is a historical throwback. Inequalities stem from slavery and that and that. Since colonial period passed through the empire and arrived at the republic, Brazilians have practiced an incomplete brand of citizenship marked by authoritarian politicians, highly patrimonial politics, various forms of racism, sexism, discrimination, and violence. Despite that, what Brazilians have lived since 1988, with the promulgation of the Constitution, the longest period of unbroken rule of law and of Republican democracy, we have not succeeded in reducing inequality, tackling structural racism against blacks and Americans, or eradicating gender violence. History is no consolidation prize. So, all those who can't understand why Brazilians are living in such intolerant and violent times, those who are surprised with so many authoritarian displays or speeches, those who watch from the stands as a whole politics of hate, turning opponents into enemies, it's better to look back and look in front. Today, a conservative wave has washed over countries, including Hungary, Poland, the United States, Russia, Italy, Israel, changing the international scene and starting new battles for the true history. The strategy is by no means new. In the former Soviet Union, the Communist Party newspaper, Pravda, a term that translates as true, defended authoritarianism as the only possible narrative. Even countries recognized for their liberal tradition can falter when they need to remember a past they rather forget. The Vichy regime in France is an example when the local elites collaborated with the Nazis. One can remember the case of Spain, which still cannot reconcile itself to the violence of the Civil War. Eliminating places of memory, to use Pierre Norat's beautiful term, is a common, generalized practice. However, this type of attitude is even more recurrent in society in which history participates directly in the political struggle. In Brazil, we find ourselves on the crest of a conservative wave. After all, a certain demonization of gender issues, attacks on social minorities, distrust of the institution and parties, the split into dualities of us, the just, and them, the corrupt, the belligerence toward intellectuals and press, justifications for order and violence arming the population, attack against the Constitution, and finally, using a mythic history. All of this is part of a long narrative which has nevertheless immense impact on our nation and contemporary context. The only thing is new, in my opinion, is that the new government of Brazil is authorizing an open, intolerant citizenship. The myth of racial democracy, to end here, which has such an impact in Brazil, is a good pretext, therefore, for understanding how authoritarian practices and ideas form and take hold in Brazil. But there are other important windows onto the subject: patriarchalism, oligarchical regime, violence, inequality, corruption, and social intolerance are all elements that remain stubbornly present today. Those questions are part of our past and also about our present. Last example. In 1906, Brazil was invited to take part of the Universal Congress of Races. The official representative was João Batista Lacerda from National Museum that concluded that Brazil, in 3 generations, Brazil would be white. You can see the grandmother, the father, the mother, and the son in the middle. That's and this picture was created in 1895. Let's jump to 2019. This is a propaganda from the MEC, from the official government, to show how black people, can enter in an university and finish a university. But I want you to look carefully to her right hand and arm. That is black. Now, look now to the, you look to the left. Now look to the right hand. That is white. If you do not trust me that the message is whitening, have a look here. No. This is a video created by Mac. And this is 2019. History is not fast acting package. What it can do is to help to create a more critical discussion about Brazilian past, our present, and dream of future. Also about our real ghost. Toni Morrison, who the memorial happens today, wrote in 1987 a novel called Beloved. Based on a real history, Beloved is the story of a house, the 421 house, inhabited by 3 women in the period immediately after the abolition of slavery in the United States. I'm not going to give you a spoiler saying that in the house 41, there were 3 women, 2 real women, and 1 ghost. One was the mother, the other 2, the daughters. One of the daughters survived the slave system and the Civil War. The other one did not. She was a ghost. But Toni Morrison repeated that in the house 421 lived 3 women, 2 real, 1 ghost. But the ghost was the only real one. Thank you so much.
I think we will hear from Arcadio Diaz-Quiñones now.
Well, it's a great honor to be here with Lily and Deborah. Thank you, Brazil Lab, for inviting me and for organizing this event. Thank you very, very much. One of the persons that I knew when I arrived at Princeton and really touched us very deeply, Alma and I, was Albert Hirschman and Sarah Hirschman. And Albert used to refer to the art of trespassing, no? Knowledge, exchange, meetings, discussions, for him was the ideal university and the ideal intellectual life. And I come here to trespass, because of course I am, in many ways, learning every day about Brazil. I have no expertise, but I am a reader of books, and I met Lily, I think more than 20 years ago, and we have been talking since then about slavery, colonialism, lies and silences in the Caribbean. The mythology of racial democracy runs very deep too, and I think that my remarks on this book also will continue that. A book which I have read with great admiration. Let me first refer to the cover of the book, the beginning, and then I will also, I like beginnings, as you know, and I like endings too. And the cover of this book is such a beautiful cover, but so significant too. There is a note right there at the beginning by Lily about the artist, Sonia Gomez, and she's part of also the Afro-Atlantic exhibit. I remember I first saw that image in that beautiful catalog, and I think it's important because it has to do with history and memory as well. No? And the last word, a way of reading a book, maybe we always, like all the children and young people, you want to rush to the end, and the last word is also so significant: courage. Courage is the last word. It's a beautiful quote from Guimarães Rosa. So the book begins with this very significant and beautiful cover by an artist and ends with the word courage. And I think it frames the essay very beautifully and very significantly. Joao told me I had 10 minutes and 2 minutes for questions, I hope. And so I just decided to spend my 10 minutes in 10 key words or concepts, and I have organized it that way. The first one, this is really a brilliant and courageous intervention. It might be best described, I think, as a powerful case of thinking with history a title by the great Princeton scholar Karl Schwarcz, which I like very much, Thinking with History, and also thinking with memory against the authoritarian disregard for human beings, disregard for the planet, and the dismantling, and this is very important, of real but very vulnerable democratic institutions. Thinking with history and memory to find our way out of the Republican deficit, and specifically out of the open racism, misogyny, homophobia, and many other things. Number two, another key word, remembering. This essay is both scholarly, because it can only be written by someone who has spent many, many years studying history, anthropology, and all kinds of issues, and reading all the secondary studies and the literature. But it's also a very personal book, which might be a bit different from other books by Lilia that I have read. A very personal. It is about remembering, and she states so very clearly on page 20. What we intend to do in this book is to remember, ¿no? O que pretendemos hacer aquí en este libro es lembrar, ¿no? And I think it's very significant, that verb. And it reminded me, and I was happy to see here again, to hear her refer to Toni Morrison, because it reminded me of Toni Morrison, whom she quotes, as a matter of fact, in the book on page 40. And Toni Morrison wrote, now we can read it, a very beautiful short text which is titled Rememory, which I suggest, if you don't know it, to read it. And I think this book is also about rememory in the way Toni Morrison looks at it. And Sonia Gomez's art was titled A Sculpture of Memory. So remembering and history are two very key concepts. And this work is made of threads, knots, textile, and varied fragments, which I first saw in the wonderful catalog of Historias Afro-Atlánticas. The other word, key, I think I have mentioned already, is courage. It is all through the essay, and it is the last word of the essay. And in that sense, it is written with a with deeply moving personal urgency. The author, Lilia, has made a moral choice to denounce the historical and moral vacuum of Brazilian so-called cordiality and racial democracy. Not just the present, but the tradition and the mythology of racial democracy and cordiality. The book is organized around key words, as a matter of fact, and topics, and they are corruption, social inequality, race and gender, masculine white privilege, misogynism, homophobia, and violence. Brutal killings. So in a way, it is a sort of j'accuse. It has that tone of great intellectual tradition of the j'accuse. I accuse. The fourth important term is colonialism and slavery. Lilia's deep knowledge about the long arc of history allows her to tell the story of how colonialism and slavery have formed the Brazilian present, and in that sense, very similar to the Caribbean, of course, as I know it. Fueling racism and gender inequality, silencing powerful anti-democratic currents in Brazilian society, and leading very often to sheer ordinariness of cruelty, as is the case today. Enslaved African and indigenous peoples got really very little for their generations of stolen bodies, snatched children, and expropriated labor. That runs very strongly in the book. Number 5, another key concept of word, the persistence, I would call it the persistence of the old regime, the persistence of privilege. Privilege is a key word here, too. The private legal system, privatized in so many ways and historical ways. Privilege, but especially white privilege. While white and whiteness often as a signal of power and prestige. It is very much an essay about the persistence of the old regime because Brazil has managed to establish an authoritarian model of politics that has characterized Brazilian elites and their privilege, private laws, the blurring of the public and the private. Chapter 3, for instance, on patrimonialism, is the center in this essay. But do not miss Chapter 5 on inequality in education and an incredible dual system. Based on a body of historiography and sociological studies, Lili demonstrates how the state has used sanctioned violence against Afro-Brazilians and indigenous communities, also on Chapter 6 on violence. Number 6, I titled this Numbers and Poetry. Lili Schwarcz writes with eloquence and clarity. She manages to be concrete and particular, documenting, and there are many facts here and documentation, a lot of documentation, documenting the present and the past, based on historical studies, images, but also literary visions, while providing statistics for particular cases and moments. It's a mix of poetry, film, images, and statistics. She's drawing all the time insights from poets and philosophers, sociologists and artists. And it is a compelling and passionate book whose aim is to incite the reader to read those artists, to see that artistic work and to read those poets. More, number 7, on poetry and art. Lili mixes history and silencing of history, what history cannot capture, with how poetry captures art and photography, all the forms in which women and men and LGBTQ reassert their humanity. To understand how she has reached a position, a moral position, we must take a look, I think, at her entire work, and especially to her Brazil, the recent book, Brazil, a Biography, co-authored with Eloisa Sterling, where in the introduction they refer to the long shadow of slavery and violence in Brazilian society, and to the numerous forms of social exclusion. And especially, I think, we need to go back to her outstanding book on Lima Barreto, a very useful, important book for the politics of memory. Number 8, fascist lies and reality. That's an important topic in this book, in this essay. Like Hannah Arendt, who is quoted in the book, stated, most of the situations in which we find ourselves are products of history, precisely, and therefore our views, habits, and institutions are contingent, not due to nature and necessity. But no questions can be more urgent than the one of the questions posed by Hannah Arendt, whom Lili quotes, the question concerning fascist lies and reality, and the comparison with Europe in that sense. Number 9, very close to us here too, very important for all of us, academic and intellectual resistance. Lurking behind all these historical questions, there is another contentious contemporary one. What should or what can academics and universities do today in the middle of authoritarian regimes like Brazil and the United States? I think that's one of the most powerful, sort of taken for granted, implied question in this book. What does it mean to resist for academics and for intellectuals? What is Lili Schwarcz telling us about her own experience as a woman, a female academic, historian, intellectual, curator, challenging museum exhibits, challenging historical narratives, challenging racism? And number 10, my own last one, is also courage. Courage. Lili is engaged in a moral and political task, transforming herself into a public intellectual. And this is a difference with some of her previous books, because here it's clearly the intention is to become a public intellectual. Remembering and forgetting, but also she's fully aware that history can repeat itself, that ghosts indeed can and do come back. But what does public life mean? There is no single answer to that question. In this long crisis, these dark times, as Hannah Arendt said, Lili Schwarcz has transformed herself into a public intellectual, mainly in books, speech, and action. Her collaboration in Nexus for some years now, and her own, I didn't know about it until recently because she had not told us, her own didactic canal, the YouTube. Amazing, I have been seeing it thanks to Marina, where she performs her didactic role with all her grace and energy. In that sense, she's a guide and inspiration too. My questions are related to, particularly to this last point. Public intellectual, voice and loyalty. My question for Lilia and for all of us is, what does it mean, really, for an academic today to engage in the public political sphere? I am not questioning now I don't want to go into the debate of the public sphere and the Constitution, Habermasian discussions. No, I'm interested more in the academic and the intellectual and how to engage in public political sphere. What does it really mean to teach beyond the university? To go beyond the institution? On the other hand, and very related to that first question, my second is the transformation not only of the intellectuals, but of the universities in Brazil. And Brazil these days very similar to the United States. In moments of crisis, not only do intellectuals perhaps transform themselves, but also the institutions. How are academic institutions, how can academic institutions be transformed in Brazil and perhaps right here? Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you, Arcadio. Now we hear from Deborah Diniz.
It's a great privilege to be here today, not just with all of you, but especially with João, Lilia, and Professor Arcadio. And it's, again, a great pleasure to be for the second time at the Brazilian Lab. And this opportunity to have the chance of hearing you. And João told me a different homework than Professor Arcadio. He told me that I have just 5 minutes and just questions. So no space to have any comment, is what he said.
They do whatever they want. Time is yours.
No. And
Not going to answer, so time is
no, because I'm sure that all of us, we would like to hear you today more. And after hearing Professor Arcadio and giving us the opportunity to understand better your book, and it's my book who is turning around. It's my book. So, yeah, it's my book. And it's the number 2001 maybe, and it's a huge achievement in Brazil. And so I have 3 boxes of questions to you. It's really very simple. And one is I'm naming as a political question. A second one is an existential question. And the third one is really a theoretical question, but that I would like to have the opportunity to hear you a little bit more. The first one is that you open your book and your presentation today with this first big question about Brazil, saying how to write a history of Brazil. But you are a person, a woman intellectual in Brazil, rewriting our history. And my question is that you raise it here for myths about Brazil, about us. And I will not repeat to you. But as Professor Ricardo said, you had a moral choice in this book. And as a woman writer in this country, in Brazil, I mean, it means a lot to put the finger in our history and say, j'accuse. And rewriting is rememory, as you said. So my question to you is, how is to be a woman's historian, rewriting, remembering the history from the political perspective, from the moral grounds that you decided to take? But it's incredible. And for me, it was a lesson today, because not even once she said his name. Yeah. And yeah, this is amazing, because she talked about our past. She talked about what is the roots of what is happening in this country, in Brazil, and at this moment, but she didn't mention his name. And it's not by chance, of course. And what does it mean to be so, I would say, polite, and because I cannot be like that. So it's really amazing that we had this opportunity today. The second one again, and as you can see, I'm repeating Professor Ricardo in almost everything, using that word as ours, the courage. And how is to be an engaged intellectual? Professor Ricardo said public intellectual, and I'm using that concept as an engaged intellectual. And you had a goal, and you started this presentation saying, I'm really sorry, because this is not an academic book. It's for the movable middle of Brazilian democracy, Brazilian society, but I'm here, and I'm sharing what I did. So when you wrote this book, you took risks about a strong and established academic journey, writing that. I don't want to hear about risks, because I can open the Twitter and read what people say about an academic writing a book like that, being at YouTube, being at Naxu. What I want to hear from you is, what is the beauty of doing that? What we can learn today, that we can move from today to do what you have been doing, to change what is happening in Brazil at this moment. And my third question, and as a learner, I used a concept at the conclusion, and I've promised you a week ago that I would concentrate my comments here on the introduction, but I'm jumping to the conclusion, and you used a concept of polarization. And I really wonder, because it's in Bolivia now, it's in Chile now, it's in US now, it's in Eastern Europe, it's in India, it's Sri Lanka. In every place that we go, we hear this concept, oh, what is happening here related to hate, related to the weakness of democracy is polarization. Is it the right concept? If we're rewriting the history, if we're going deep to our myths, is to talk about polarization, or it's something else? I really don't know. It's a genuine question to you, but my guess is that this is one of our ghosts that is showing up in front of us. And because of the lack of our vocabulary, we're using a vocabulary created by the far right. Thank you, Lilia. Thank you for your amazing work.
Just sit here. Okay, great. Well, okay. Thank you so much, Arcadio and Deborah. So Lily, you have 30 seconds to respond.
As
No.
I have,
No, so we will take a few minutes for Lily to go over some of her general impressions, and then we will open up. Just give us, if you want to warm up a little bit, the conversation, maybe addressing some of the questions that Arcadio asked about, this, the public intellectual, the outside, beyond the academy, transformation of university, but then the question of the political, the beauty, and the theme of the term polarization, if it actually fits or if there's some other ghost here begging for a different name. If I got the series of questions, so just give us some broad answers, and then we want to open to you all, and we will open in bundles. We will collect a series of questions. We want to encourage you all to be very concise and try to exercise the art of condensation, and so that we can get more voices around the table, and then we can have more time also to get more bundles around and more discussion going.
Okay. So, thank you so much. Arcadio and Deborah are more my heroes, so two public intellectuals. So with Arcadio, he taught me how to be a political machine, a political person. He taught us how not to accommodate, how to see other things. So he is my hero, and he is a public intellectual in his fight for democracy, in his fight for equality, in his last fight because of the ecological disaster in Puerto Rico. And Deborah, that is... sorry.
Maybe if you go there,
Sorry. Do I have to say again why Arcadio is my hero? I would love to, Arcadio. I'm going to give one example, if you allowed me, because I met Arcadio when I went to a seminary in Buenos Aires. I didn't know he was Arcadio. I just sat there, I had a lecture to give, and I noted that man, he knew about everything. And he would correct me in Brazilian history that he said he has no idea about Brazilian history. And I went back home really sad, and I said to my husband, I'm so ignorant. I know nothing about Latin America. And then Pedro invited me. I remember that I was here to give a lecture about a soccer game that I'm studying for more than 10 years called Black Against White in the Heliópolis favela. I'm not going to talk about this. But then Pedro said to me, don't you think it would be a good idea to come and to be a visiting professor? And I remember I was entered at the University of São Paulo to give my class in the anthropology department. And I said to Pedro, unfortunately, Pedro, I don't have time. I promised to my family that I would stay home, that I would not come to Princeton. Sorry. And then I continued going to my class, and then I remembered Arcadio. And Pedro is here, and he can testify. And I called him back at 5 minutes, and I said, Pedro, tell me something. That man called, I always call him in a wrong way, Arcadio Dias Quiñones, I say. Today was correct. I said, Pedro, is that man Arcadio? He said, yes. So I said, so I'm going. And then Deborah is this person that is so important for us, that she cannot be in our country, he cannot stay in our country because of this kind of authoritarian governance. At the same time, she means so much to us in this fight as a woman, in her fight for equality, justice. So it's so meaningful to me to have you here. And I'm so sad that you cannot be in Brazil. But you must believe that you have a very important role here in the United States talking to us in Brazil. Your voice is very strong. So it's very difficult to answer them. I'm very malandra because I said that both of them are public intellectuals, so I cannot answer those questions, but I can. Let me just give my example that it's not an example that you can export. Arcadio knows that I work in, I have a lot of chairs. I work in a publishing house, I work at the museum, I teach, I write. And then I always thought that university was not enough for me, always. So I have a lot of things that I have books that I write anonymously with another name, children books. I have this channel that I do not talk about, but about the channel with my colleagues in the university, and I try my best to be part of the academic ritual. I'm a person, I was formed by the academy. Academy is whole my life, so I'm part of it. But at the same time, we are experiencing a moment that we have to go public. I don't know why, but I thought that maybe as I have this publishing house on my back, that I am a public person, that I could do it. So I started, I received, I don't know, I do not have a recipe how to be a public intellectual. I just have my example. That is not a lot. So I received an invitation in the beginning of 2018 by a man from a bank that said to me that I had to open a channel. Because, and he showed me a program in the south of the country called Parallel Brazil. It's terrible, but I think you have to have a look. And I said, I can't, I don't know how to do it. And at the end of 2018, I called him and I said, are you still considering having the... So he said, yes. Then I started. Also, I started my Instagram. I started the Instagram because Adriano Pedrosa, the director of MASP, insisted that I had to have it to show art and to ask people, to try to give examples and try to speak with people. Then suddenly, when I read about our new ministers, I started every day talking about one minister. And so I started with our astronaut minister, talking about pillows, the propaganda that he was. And the people were very aggressive with me. And it was the first time I was called esquerdopata in caption letters like this. At the first moment, I was like, oh, maybe I have to stop. But there is something that was saying, no, go ahead. And then I continued. And then I didn't know at that time that all my response were public. So I started answering people, thoughting it was very private. And I started saying things like this. It's the same genre, giving examples, giving the data, and also saying at the end, thank you so much. I think that was too much. Until one day my daughter came to me and said, Mother, your answers are very good. I said, how can you know my answers are good? And Julia said, everybody knows. So, and what's the beauty? Because now I know, now I have 100,000 followers, and two. And I know most of them are very nice with me. And most of them they ask me very good questions that I do not have in our university. Most of them want to share examples with me. Most of them sometimes they do not agree with me, but now they call me professor. It's very funny. It's another kind of being, another way of being a professor. So the beauty is the interaction. And the beauty is also because I think that inside academy, we live in a very nice country, a very beautiful country. But sometimes, not always, we are very isolated. And we do not receive the kind of questions that I am receiving, that I have to prepare myself to answer these questions. Last thing, being a woman. This is a challenge, and you know better than I do. No, we are both women, but you are facing this kind of problem. The first example I had, it was when I finished my book, Brazil, a biography, that not just one journalist I would say 6 journalists asked me a question like this: how do you feel being a woman and talking about everything in Brazil? And I answer like this: did you ask the same question to Boris Fausto? So that was the beginning, or asking questions about my husband, or asking questions about soccer. How can you talk about soccer? I said, yes, because I'm from Corinthians. So, but then it's very difficult because we are always facing this kind of thing that we cannot talk about very difficult subjects, that women cannot talk about economics, and Lena is here, that women cannot talk about the whole history, the whole picture. We can talk about art, we can talk about culture, we are allowed to talk about what? Family. We are very good in talking about family, domestic sphere, but we cannot talk about this. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that I think we have to face, and polarization. I don't know the name of this. The thing is, I finished the book talking about intolerance. And for me, this is a brand new thing. Not that Brazilians are intolerant. What's a brand new thing? That Brazilians are liking to depict themselves as intolerant. That's new. I don't know if we are importing this or not. I don't know if it's a natural, it's a Brazilian translation. But the thing is, we were intolerant, but we didn't like to say we were intolerant. And now you have lots of people that like to say they are intolerant. I'm going to give you an example that happened not yesterday, the day before yesterday. Yesterday, it was a holiday in Brazil, the national day of the Black conscience. And the day before, a congressman saw an exhibition in Brasilia and didn't like the exhibition. In Congress. It was about the genocide of the Black population. And this particular congressman, that is from it's a military, he asked his, can I use assessor? No. Yeah. Advisor, the person that works with him, to film him, and he went there. And he decided to break the signs, really to break. So what kind of example is this? And it's open. So that's why I think that we are translating polarization, I don't know. But then this man allowed a lot of people to show how violent they are, to show how intolerant they are. And that's new, the representation. To finish, the name. That was on purpose, of course, because I don't want to use our president, the case of our president, as a cause. He's not a cause. He's a consequence. He's a symptom. That's why I didn't want to write his name. And that's why I showed him, but I didn't want to talk about him, because that would be very easy to say it's his fault, it's his problem. It's not. It's our problem. No? Thank you.
So we have some extra seats there. So let's collect a first round of brief comments and questions. Okay, Henry?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for all these presentations. I have a thought about polarization and about the question whether this really is sort of an important part of what we're going through, and whether this really is sort of a useful analytical concept for understanding what's going on. It's a sort of historical memory. So I'm German, and I was raised with a lot of memories, sort of growing up in the 70s in Germany. And the Holocaust and the Nazi period were very much present to us. Some of the teachers, the older teachers, had been in Hitler's army, had been in Hitler's political party. But one thing that we definitely also remembered very well was the polarization of the 1920s and 30s in Germany. the street fights between the left and the right in Berlin, the intolerance, the violence. And so it seems to me that to the extent that we're maybe replaying, maybe in some sort of variation, things that happened in Europe in the 20s and 30s, it does seem to me that polarization is part of the picture. And another thing, so about the new preference for showing oneself to be intolerant, not just to be intolerant, but liking, depicting oneself to be intolerant. Again, that's something that, of course, the Nazis did sort of on a very large scale. So think about the burning of the books. It's very similar, right?
Yes, Leo?
So thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. We had a wonderful time here. So my question to all of you is, to what extent the fact that we have this deep roots in authoritarianism, violence, is something that really blocks us from being able to discuss reparation, truth commissions, and things like this. I think it's important because in the U.S., for instance, where we also have racism and other countries, and I'm thinking about, of course, Germany after war, because reparation was, you see, put on the table, and the Germans have to face it, and they're still paying for it. To what extent this is something, because this would be a possibility of dialogue, and I think that there is no possibility of dialogue in Brazil so far. On the political side, on the side of, you see, racial issues, political issues, left, right. So to what extent those roots are really blocking us from the possibility of moving further to first acknowledge and then move towards reparation?
Yes, please. Ernest, yes.
Thank you very much, Lily, for your presentation and for the comments. My question is actually related to one worry that the Brazilian leaders had in the during the Brazilian Empire was the fear of Haitianism.
Yeah.
And which had to do with worry that the black population would revolt and kill their masters the same way that the Haitians did at the end of the 17th century. We know that in Brazil, for the past 15, 20 years, there had been some progress in terms of affirmative action. I think last week or the week before, we had these numbers that for the first time in the public universities we had the majority of black people, including the federal and the state universities. Even USP, where you come from now, USP was one of the last universities to actually implement
You are
affirmative
very
action.
nice, the last.
One of the- So, and of course, for this past 15 years, we had a generation of young black people that, for the first time in their family, they started going to the university, and now, you also have affirmative actions for civil service jobs as well. This is all encoded in federal law. The Supreme Court has already spoken about the constitutionality of these laws, and this is all well established. So my question is, in view of this polarization and the onset of extreme right groups in Brazil, I think yesterday or the day before, I saw this news that there are over 330 neo-Nazi groups in Brazil, including in my hometown, which is a place where you would never have imagined, João Pessoa, there would be a neo-Nazi cell there. So how do you see that the interplay between this progressiveness that we had in the past 15 years and this pushback? What would be the consequences in the long term?
And feel free, Deborah and Arcadio, to kick in, to respond to to Lily, because we want to have a conversation. That's the idea. Now it's on. Yeah, feel free out here.
Wanna start?
No, you go ahead.
You I have to go there.
Or if you speak loud.
I will try. Let me say if it's enough. So thank you, Henrika. I agree completely with you. I think that we are facing this polarization, this open polarization. And I want to give one more example that you could compare with the Nazi system, is that our president, to win the elections 2008, he joined a very little party, the PSL. And then he almost created this party because it was a very weak one without personality, and lots of people entered this party, and the party became giant. This year, into the second semester of 2019, the president is facing lots of problems with this party, that is also known as the WhatsApp party, because they are all the time listening to themselves and showing things all the time. And now, just now, the day before yesterday, I'm giving you very fresh examples. He created a new party. So he is the owner of the ball, of the game, you know. I don't want to play with you any longer. And then he created a new party. And what a coincidence. He said today that he thinks that it would be good if he will be the president of the new party. So he will be the president and the president of his party. You know the story, no?
And his
That's
son will be the vice president.
sorry.
His son will be the
Yes.
vice president.
Second thing, the son Eduardo. When I mentioned that they do not respect constitution, Eduardo, having in mind the events that are happening in Chile and Bolivia, he said, if the left wing would be radical, I would not be shy, and I will close I will close the camera, and I will introduce the Ato Institucional 5, a Institutional Act 5, that during the dictatorship stole the Brazilian rights in all the senses we can say. So that's why I said that we are experiencing a global Weimar, when democracy failed, and when we saw the creation of these large parties, very radical parties. So that's why I cannot find another name, maybe not correct, but I cannot. Reparation. Lena knows that I'm deep in this subject, no? Because I think we had reparation during the slave system. Yes, for the owner. Because slaves paid for the alforria. I don't know the name alforria. We had, that was a, Isadora, help me.
Manumission.
Manumission. But it was a very special kind of manumission, because it's a very special kind, no, Isadora, because it's when the slave pay for his or her manumission. And as Elena said, as we don't acknowledge, we don't discuss reparation. So quota system, affirmative action, okay, but reparation, never. And the slaves, former slaves, libertos, because I'm studying this, paid a lot to free themselves, or to free the spouse, to free the husband, to free the son, to free the daughter, but never. Second, reparation that we do not talk, dictatorship. Not all, but most of our neighbors discussed this subject. We had a Truth Commission, and we didn't talk about reparation. We have a big constitution, the 88 Constitution, the Citizenship Constitution. It's a very good one, protects the country. It was a constitution created during, at the end of the dictatorship. And Ulisses Guimarães, I forgot to put this photo, but it's a beautiful photo that he showed the constitution and said, I show this to the Brazilian people with, now you have to help me, nojo. Disgust of dictatorship. So it was a very good constitution in order to protect us against dictatorship. But there was, you can find many, many problems. And one of them is that we do not touch the militaries. And we are facing this now. So reparation is a deep problem in Brazil. Haiti. To give you another example of the importance of Arcadio and Alma, we discussed this topic, and I wrote a special text in this new Dictionary of the Republic about Haiti. My dear friend Eloisa, she loved to say that we had three traditions of the republicanism. The American, the North American one, the English one, and the French one. And when I mentioned the Haitian one, she said, that's not real. That's just French. I said, no. It was a very radical, with a new language. And the most important thing is, because Flavio Gomes wrote another chapter about how fast ideas coming from Haiti arrived in Brazil. And immediately he found an enslaved that had the name of Dessalines in his left arm. So it was very, very strong. Affirmative action. I think you know, and it's important to know, that in 2022, our congressmen are going to judge if we are continuing to have quota systems and affirmative action or not. So let us use our mathematics that with human science not always are very good, no? But Bolsonaro will be there. So what's going to happen? So that's very strong in a country that, as you mentioned, the neo-Nazis are stronger and stronger. I'm studying a town that I mentioned the other day called 13 de Maio, May 13. May 13 is the day of our official abolition. 13 de Maio, May 13, is a town, a little town in Santa Catarina. And I studied this town because 99% of the population voted for Bolsonaro. Now I'm saying the name. And then I like to work with images. And still have, in front of the town, they used to have a former slaves' broken chains. And now, I can show you the image. They have a black person with a movement like this, without chains. And now they are rebuilding the story, saying that May 13 is an important passage in the history of the European immigration. And there is nothing to do with the slave system when we know that the name of this town is based in a quilombo, that it was located very, very nearby of this town. So this is, again, just an example. I call backlash. I think that in 30 years, no democracy is perfect. No, we have to fight for our rights every day. Everyone knows about it. But then, in 30 years, we can say that our institutions were strong enough, no? And we thought that democracy was the end of the line. And we are really experienced backlash that have consequences, very long, very, very deep consequences. I'm talking about education. The numbers I give in education, the backlash in education, it's unbelievable. The backlash in civil rights, it's unbelievable. Yesterday, not yesterday, yes, the day before, yes, because yesterday was a holiday, our Minister of the Family, talking about family, Damaris, that saw Christ in a tree, she said that Goiaba tree. She said that she's going to accuse all the professors that will not respond. So they are going to be judged by the parents. They are going to be judged by society if they are talking things that they cannot talk. So that's censorship. That reminds me a lot what's happening in Brazil. Our president, he censored a propaganda from the Banco do Brasil. That it was a very naive one. The only thing was you could see all kinds of people, black people, white people, gay people, no, not even gay, it was not aggressive. He censored and he dismissed the secretary that used to take care of the communication. So if that's not censorship, I don't know the name. No, and it's very, very strong, very difficult. But I do talk about courage. I do talk at the end of the book that the term crisis has the meaning of decision. So I really think that civil society in Brazil has a decision, have to have a decision now. It's a moment of decision. It's a moment of resistance. And I think that everyone can be a person that can multiply. Everyone in his or her place, it's can project another Brazil, can fight for another Brazil. Thank you.
So we collect one more round of questions. So we have Rodrigo, Pedro. I also registered, and I will get you guys. Yes. Okay. So, okay, so yeah.
I would like to hear a little bit more about the importance of the public, to be a public intellectual, or as said Professor Arcadio, to teach beyond the university, because I guess everybody agrees on the importance of communications, but when it comes to reality, we still have a lot of problems. So, for example, if we're thinking about the Brazilian scenario, we know that Professor Debra, Professor Lilia, maybe one or two in Brazil, like Vladimir Safatli or...
Most of us are women.
Yeah, and I would say that Angela Alonso, they are facing the situation. So I would like to know what's the big problem there. And I'm saying as someone in the academia and also as someone in journalism, I know how hard it is to deal with some journalists sometimes, but I know that I still believe it's possible. So I'm thinking about how to how to build some bridges between university and journalists, because I know the social media is really important, but journalists, I guess, would help a lot in the situation nowadays. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that. If it's the question of a courage or to know how to do, what's the main situation?
I think there are more people raising hands. So Lily, thank you so much, and Arcadio and Deborah. It's a timely, important discussion. I have a question, a couple of questions quickly. One is about polarization. It seems that Deborah brought up the issue, and you said you don't have an answer for this moment in which finally the conceptual framework would need to be changed. But it seems that you have a guess, and so I would love to hear more and from you as well. I mean, whether this is beyond the crisis of the liberal democratic pact during the interwar period or not, the fact is that polarization, as Hendrik termed, I mean, is still there and it's still important. And polarization happens, I mean, around certain myths and certain shared ideas that have to do with silencing as much as, I mean, it's about creating realities and parallel realities, and your book is particularly sharp at that, Lily. And one thing that is directly and indirectly present in your book is the whole discussion about fake news, and this hasn't really appeared. So, since truth and courage and memory are so important, I mean, what to do? How to go beyond that framework of polarization, thinking about fake news and the truth that we are kind of in quest of.
We have in the back. You want to? Hello.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you very much for your presentation and discussion, and all the discussion, which is very pertinent. I think, well, we can see because it's crowded here, so we're all very interested. And my question would be if any of you three think that this problem of authoritarianism could be read also, or deserves a reading in a global context, as we have seen like a couple of weeks ago, books had earned about 34, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know how you say in English, but they got into Congress, I mean, and there is like an authoritarian articulation which also does not only arrives to the state by the use of a democracy mechanism, by voting, I mean, but also they have, I think there is a common language which has to do with the critics of Marxism, they call it, well, Nazi feminism, and all this sort of parody of the left culture. And I think we were all very surprised when the Brazilian elections first came, because it was the first case of that, but it's more or less. I would like to hear.
Tem uma pergunta lá no fundo.
Okay, Nikhil? Nikhil and then yes, okay.
Thank you. My question is about ideology and civil society, and given the fact that when one assumes the role of a public intellectual as you assume, as was somehow bequeathed to you as well, as you talked about it, how do you interpret and sort of tackle this question of ideology, the need to move beyond left or right, and in a sense appeal to something that is perhaps more moral, perhaps something that's, that moves beyond these things? And coming from India, where again, some of these questions also become salient, as Deborah was mentioning. One of the things that keeps cropping up in the case of India is how the civility of civil society itself becomes alienating to a lot of people who perceive civil society to be somehow classed differently, have access to different kinds of cultural worlds. How do you deal with that, and how do you view your role as a public intellectual in somehow moving beyond these categories?
Federico?
Yes, thank you, Lily. Thank you all you for this wonderful discussion and presentation. Yes, I will be very, very short. I will try at least. Lily, you insist your presentation, your book, is mainly about the persistence of inequality, persistence of narratives. Then maybe coming back to the point about polarization, I don't know. Now, my question is about structure and conjuncture, maybe.
Structure?
Yes. And because now we are facing a new thing, no, a new kind of authoritarianism that rejects explicitly, as you have shown, all these myths about democracy, racial democracy, cordiality. No more. We are facing something like a bare naked authoritarianism, very aggressive and very. Then how can we think about this kind of very hard theoretical also problem, no? Persistence, continuity and discontinuity, finally. No?
And then one question that I had, and we don't need to, you guys, because here we'll actually start with Deborah and Arcadio, and then Lily, so we'll end with Lily, because we want you guys to get engaged with the conversation too. The question of the elites, right? Of the economic, media elites, right? So we know, of course, certain sectors, are benefiting from this, but we also know there are some cracks in the elite as well. Or how do you see this authoritarianism, this intolerance? How are the elites realigning themselves? But my major question was about the public intellectual, right? Because I think one of the elephants in the room is that the citizens are not the citizens we would like them to be. Okay, they were never truly cordial, but we thought they were pro some kind of social policy, social mobility, some kind of solidarity, right? And we know that the legacy of the last few decades in investment in social policy did not actually translate massively in a politics towards the continuation of that. So I think, how do you read political subjectivity now from that's marked by ideology, different kinds of ideologies, religion? There's something of, so even if the public would hear the intellectuals or the different kinds of conversations would emerge, what would be the politics of that public now, which would be different than will it be different, or will it be always according to the right and left kind of spectrum? So Deborah, you want to get started with some comments?
Yes, please. So I would say that yes, I do have a guest. Yeah, a guest. Sorry, a guest. Sorry, I do have a
It's
guest.
a theoretician who is a guest.
Yeah, is that? I'm a guest in her presentation today. So I do have a guess about that. That is based on I would say 4 points from your book. The first one is who writes the history. So having that in my mind. The second one is how to enlarge our imagination. And using history is how to enlarge our imagination about what is happening now. The third one is who created that vocabulary to explain what is happening in these countries at this moment. And a deep refuse about any kind of equivalence between what they do and what we're doing now. So I do have this ethical statement that I'm refusing any kind of equivalence. And this concept of polarization and also about backlash are two concepts that it's about who writes the story, who writes the history. When we say backlash, we are saying that the history that is told by them. There is something that we did about the, racial affirmative action that is now having the response. So it's about who writes the history. And I do not use backlash, because we do not use backlash to talk about the history about Republicans in this country. We keep using this concept to talk about Democrats. There is a backlash against gay marriage. It's a backlash about Roe versus Wade. But it's not a backlash about what was Bush's administration. So this is my first refusal. And the second one related to polarization is because there is a sense of equivalence in the end. It's the deepest sense that something is the two sides of something. It's not. In one side is fake news, it's hate, it's persecution. And the other side is the deep concept about democracy and about freedom, about equality. So is that. So I'm not saying that we have an emotion of polarization, but I would not, as a guess, use as a concept as I would not use backlash. But it's just a guess here.
Thank you.
Yes.
There are many entries for you.
I think I will stay with the public intellectual and journalism and possibilities, because I've been thinking a great deal about it since reading the book. I'm interested as well in the limits and the challenges of becoming or being a public intellectual, because there are limits, and there are many conflicts, and there are many challenges. So it's not just a rosy picture that you decide. I don't think that's what Lilia has done. She knows very well what the challenges are. And just to raise one particular issue that was not really discussed in the book, but that we have talked about, is the question of religious groups, which is perhaps absent on the book, but very present in everyday life, and here in this country as well, and in many other countries. Just thinking about Puerto Rico during the fiscal crisis and after the hurricane, many leftist groups are very active and very doing an incredible job. But there is a problem in the sense that there is little connection with the churches that have been very active, Protestant churches mainly, historic Protestant churches, not only the new fundamentalists. And my understanding from Brazil is that this is the case too. So the question here for journalists as well, for deep investigative journalism, is how to connect, how to establish a dialogue, how to begin to understand what religious groups really mean for the present and for the future, and even in the past. No? Even in the past. Talking about slavery in the Caribbean as well, the Catholic Church never declared itself abolitionist. But the Protestants who were there already did, and that makes a big difference. Makes a big difference. The question of religious groups and public intellectuals, because public intellectuals tend to be a very significant tradition of secular, as Edward Said said, secular worldly philosophers. So I think I want to raise that issue because I think it's important. The question of limits, challenges, difficulties. When other groups do reach an audience, public intellectuals, the tradition is in that sense very problematic at times, no? The impossibility of dialogue. I wanted to raise the issue with Lily because it's not in the book, but it is very important, I understand, in Brazilian society and very much everywhere. The other issue has to do with women, since we have been discussing, and public intellectuals. Let me give one or two examples that I always admire of non-academic intellectuals. Because here, like at Princeton and here with my students, I remember when I was teaching, many students, the word intellectual was very foreign, no? Because they thought all the people who read books and wrote and thought were really academics. No? So the idea of j'accuse and the idea of talking to power is a bit foreign to many people. I like to refer sometimes to two cases that I know very well, because I admire, in Puerto Rico, Negrita Vientos Gastón, and the poet Julia de Burgos, non-academic intellectuals, like many others, like Mariátegui in Peru and others, non-academic, because it's very hard for us now to consider intellectuals who are not academic. No? But it is true that there is a great tradition, and there, I think it's interesting that Nelita Vientos, in the 40s and 50s, was a staunch, she opposed McCarthyism, she opposed colonialism, she came against also when they sold Vieques Island for the U.S. Navy. She was one of the first very eloquent, extremely well-read, extremely capable, and Julia de Burgos as a poet in the Puerto Rican diaspora, and I'm sure we can get many examples here. Non-academic intellectuals, public intellectuals, because they did not have the academy that we all benefit from and share, and where we have met so many wonderful people too, no? So I think that's important. And journalism comes in, because I think we don't tend very often to think of journalists as intellectuals. And that's really very, very difficult to defend, because many people who are doing now, many individuals, men and women, who are doing incredible job are journalists who are not academics, and they are posing the key questions, the critical questions, and doing the research too. So I like to complicate a bit the idea of the public intellectual, women and in the public sphere, and also journalism, because I think we can all give examples of the role that journalists are playing in Brazil, in this country, and in many others. Just look at Chile now, no? In that sense, journalists, what some journalists are doing. No? That's all I wanted to say, just to complicate a bit the concept and the practice, particularly the practice, no, of standing up to power, to dictatorship, uh, and paying sometimes a very high price. Because that's the issue too. The price of the ticket, as James Baldwin used to say, is very high.
Before we hear from Lily some concluding remarks, I would just want to say that we have a wonderful reception waiting for us to the right. We will invite you all to stay, to keep the conversation going, to talk to Deborah, Lily,
not to the right, to the left. I'm just kidding. To the left, not to the right.
Okay.
It's just a bad joke.
But that's good. Everybody listen up a little bit. So we'll have a reception here on the other side. Okay, but and then you're all invited to stay, stick around, continue the conversation, and really some additional comments. But we definitely hope we will have you back. Lily's coming back in February and March to help teach a course in the Amazonia, engage with various events and activities and collaborations on campus, and we have the opportunity to hear about your next project as well. But for the time being, few additional thoughts.
Instagram.
I think a lot of people talk about public intellectual, and I think that we academics, we live with a lot of classifications. In Brazil, we have this national system called Lattes, and Lattes is a good way to see how academics work. So, for example, the work I have at MASP was not good, not enough.
Wow.
This book, for example, will be not good because it's not academic. I always call a lattice like homo lattice because, and then it's very interesting to understand what kind of X-ray we have there. Journalists are having a very important role in this, not just in this moment, but for a long time, because they are writing the books that we academics refuse to write. So we cannot complain if we do not go there and write. We cannot complain if we are not open to the public. So I really think we have to carefully build these bridges, and maybe we'll do it. So polarization, beautiful remarks that Deborah talked to us. I was talking about backlash just in civil rights. In civil rights, I think it's a backlash because of this particular 30 years. No? But you were right. And the whole book, and it's a brilliant point that Deborah mentioned and mentions again, is who is writing the history. So, and then I was accused by Veja magazine that I wrote a myth. So now it's good. I love that because then you can show what's okay. We are not. What I wanted to I say in the first chapter is that we all are creating our history. But I also say that I do not have an opinion about education. I do not have an opinion about gender. That's why I use a lot of statistics. Because my main goal is to show how you have different meanings for knowledge and how we can deal with this, how we can cope with this, how it's important that we will deal with this. So fake news, that's it. So I'm sure, and I read, and Deborah said that people from the right wing, they say that I am creating myths. So fake news is something like this. We have to try, and it's the same question that Vicky asked me, that we have to, my opinion, we have to try to deal with these people and try to use data to show them because normally, Pedro, when I answer, I cannot answer all the comments, but I like to answer the comments that are very much against me. And then I used to go with a lot of data. And at the end, I always say, thank you very much. And that's fair enough. And some of them will continue like this. You are scared of pata, you are this, and they use a lot of drawings, this kind of language. Then you do not have to answer again. But my only way to, perhaps I'm an enlightenment person, but I think that's the only way to compete. That's the only way to say, I do not have an opinion like you have. I have a knowledge, and I want to show you. I want to share with you. Could you share with me your knowledge? And then it's empty, an empty basket. But it's not an answer. It's a very good question. Sobre authoritarianism. Oh, ideology. Ideology is a very complicated word, and it's even worse in Brazil because the right wing, they are using ideology of gender. They created this expression that do not exist, and we keep insisting that's not ideology, options or something like this. And it's not, so we have to create new terms. I keep talking about social markers of difference. Sometimes the people that are very against me, they say, this is like ideology. Or they say, oh, this is good. What's the meaning of this? So we try. We have to give a try. Another thing that I think that's about authoritarianism, I decided to call this book, it was a big discussion, Sobre o Autoritarismo Brasileiro. Not like sobre o autoritarismo no Brasil. That would be very different. I don't know if you can understand. Because if I say sobre o autoritarismo brasileiro, I'm saying that I have an old history here, that it's ours. I'm not telling, all the time I'm dealing, and Federico, he's right, with this idea of what's persistent, what is new, what is global, what is local. And I talk a lot about what is global, but I wanted to talk about local. I wanted very much. That's why I didn't call it sobre autoritarismo no Brasil, but sobre autoritarismo brasileiro. I don't know if it makes sense. And beautiful question. I think in the book I say that there is something that is brand new. All these elections started with Trump were won using net, no, social net. It's the first time that a president is elected not going to a dialogue. It's the first time that you have presidents that don't want to go to a dialogue. They want to talk with their own bubbles, I don't know, with their own group. No? So I think that's brand new. And that's important. That's why I think, and maybe I'm naive, that we have to game this game. We have to go to this game. Because otherwise, these people that can follow you, and they have a kind of feeling of orphanage, they are going to other sides. And I know this is very, I know that it's like this. When I have a launching of a book, people cry, they talk. It's okay, it's going to be over. But the most important, I always give them books. I always give them articles because I think that this is brand new, and we will have to deal. The left will have to deal with this kind of language, and because the right they are dealing with this. So João and Arcadio, the elite in Brazil and the elite as the elite, it's a plural elite. But when they have to define again, they are united. And the left side, it's always divided. I remember Monty Python or other kinds of examples, no? And then our elite is very unique in this sense. They vote during the first round, they didn't vote for Bolsonaro. During the second round, they voted for Bolsonaro. Because one thing that I try to explain in the book is that you have this anti-PT phenomenon, talking about polarization, no? How they wanted to transform PT. I'm not saying that, I wrote a chapter about corruption, that it was the most difficult one because I talk about PT. I try to talk about all of it. But even so, I forgot now, but it's over. But the thing is, we are always divided. Left sides are always divided. And the elite is always, so now they are working in a center candidate. I was, for example, Global said to me 2 days ago that they wanted an interview. They said things like this: do you think that a center candidate is possible? And then I said, could you send me the questions? And the questions were very tricky because they wanted me to say that I was that I was going to vote for the center. So this is very particular. One thing is to say, okay, we can have a center candidate. The other thing is to say, I'm going to support them. That's another thing. That's my subjectivity. And Arcadio is right. We talked a lot about, and during this lunch, one example that Arcadio gave me that it's very important for you, Rodrigo, it's the other side. When Borges was invited to teach, and they came to Borges, and correct me if I'm wrong, and asked him, how you that always wrote about literature, how do you think you can be a professor? And Borges answered, I prepared myself my whole life for this. So you have opposite examples for us. Finally, the book, when I had to put a date in the book, a day and a month and a year at the end of the book. Because I knew, and I finished saying that times were passing very fast, because I knew that book would be, that I would have lots of things that would change. For example, I talked about Moro, but then that thing I asked to have a keynote is the only keynote. The ones who has a second edition is the only keynote. And also because I know that I didn't talk about religion, because I'm studying it now. It's so complicated. So I mention it in the last chapter, and I say, that's a word. And if you do not want to demonize, that the people would demonize us, I'm sure we cannot demonize them, because you have all variations of church. And we didn't talk about this during our lunch, but I didn't deal with a very important problem in our country, not a problem, a phenomenon, that is region. What is happening in the northeast of the country that votes for PT, what's happening in the south of the country that vote massively to PSL, to Bolsonaro. So this is a question that we will have to face and deal, but it's future. That's why I was very malandra, and I put a day, a specific day, and a month, and a year. Thank you so much.
We will look forward to having you back. We have the book on